And I'm going to start talking English right from the start because we have a wonderful international panel of people today here, of journalists. So we will be going on forward like this. We have a combination of people. We have Michael here, we have Ganna with me in the studio. We also have Ekaterina, Carlos, and Enrique over Zoom. And over the next hour, we're going to be discussing the role of media in resolving social and political conflicts. Now, I think we're going to go through several key aspects without which this is impossible. So first of all, the general role of media in a society. What is it supposed to do? Just report, intervene, perform direct action when something critical happens. I would also like us to discuss the partisanship of media, political allegiance, ideological allegiance, and how that influences the possibility of dialogue and conflict resolution through media. I also want to take a few steps through the opportunities that social media give in terms of conflict and resolution, because we're all talking all the time about how social media creates bubbles, how social media negatively affects our chance of cohesion, but I think there's a lot of opportunities there, and I would love for us to discuss them. And finally, go through some opportunities of dialogue that media hold in terms of the conflict in Donbass and our chances of dialogue with people in non-government controlled areas. So I would like to start off first by addressing Michael here and Ekaterina, who is with us over Zoom. They both work in very complicated topics that often meet a strong resistance from the audience. They meet resistance from the journalistic community, and Ekaterina was even forced to leave Ukraine some time ago because of her professional activities. So I would like to ask you, how do you see yourself in the things that you do? Are you just reporting, or is this actual intervention? Do you expect social dialogue to emerge out of this? What is your expected outcome, and how is it overall?
Right, so I would say in terms of the reporting that I do on the far right, I see what I do as more than just reporting. I do see it more as, to some extent, intervention, because I think we really have seen over the past several years in a number of countries, far more than just in Ukraine, the issue of far right and attacks by the far right and things like that have happened across all sorts of Western European countries, Eastern European countries, U.S., Canada, and New Zealand, for the most paramount example. Mm-hmm. So the way that there are things in this world that we as journalists need to report on, but I think when there is an instance of a social issue, a social problem, a political problem like the rise of the far right, I think it's incumbent upon journalists like myself, like Katarina, and like many others in Ukraine and beyond. I think it's incumbent upon us to recognize the really actual and potentially damaging role that the rise of the far right can play in a lot of our countries. I think if all that we do as journalists in these situations is just report what the far right is saying or talk about what the far right is doing, I don't think that's enough. I think it's incumbent on us as journalists to really dig deeper, to act also as researchers. I mean, by way of background, I used to work in research before I got into journalism, so that does impact the way that I approach journalism as well. Mm-hmm. It's so for us, we really need to recognize that we need to dig deeper than just finding out what the far right is doing. We need to understand that we are operating in a context where far right movements are growing much more they're growing and they're becoming much more dangerous, and we have to, as journalists who specialize in this area and do have a lot of insight and things to say, it's incumbent on us to really intervene, as you said, and try to make people, politicians, thought leaders, everybody, not just more aware of the issue, but just help provide more knowledge to everybody about what the threat really is and what these groups are doing.
So you're expecting not just social dialogue on the topics that you cover, you're expecting direct action from politicians, and through your coverage to...
I would say that I would like to see direct action from politicians in response to some of the work that I do and that other journalists who cover the far right do. I don't think we're naive in terms of expecting that just because we report on a particular far right group or a particular event that all of a sudden things are immediately going to happen. But what I realize, and I think what a lot of us realize, is that especially in a climate like in Ukraine, where people, which I think we'll get into, do not like to talk about the issue with the far right for a number of reasons, it is incumbent on journalists like myself, even, well, outsiders obviously like myself, somebody who isn't from this country, to maybe try to force a dialogue to start when a lot of people would prefer that we not have that dialogue right now. So.
Thank you. Екатерина, с удовольствием бы предложил вам присоединиться к обсуждению. Ваши темы...
Ekaterina, the guest, also offered for you to talk. What is your position? Good day. The topic is difficult and multidimensional. I don't know if we managed to discuss it for this short period of time, but I would say that today, unfortunately, journalists who raise the topic of far-right problem and such phenomena, they need to be explained why neo-Nazis is dangerous. Me as a journalist, I wouldn't expect that I would be in the world where I would have to explain such things. At least I dealt with it, I faced with it when we published a story about some fake and connections of certain leading far-right representatives' opinions, and I heard questions about it. Why do you call them neo-Nazi, and who are they? Including, I heard questions like, you are raising such topics because you are a journalist and you have some ideology, maybe you're like left or left liberal journalists. Both me and my team from Zaborona, they tried to label us with the ideologists, but in fact, it has nothing to do with ideology or ideological or political journalism. It's a matter of the foundations and human rights and violation of human rights. Yes, I think that today the most important thing is to discuss in the society these questions where we need to find a space or a platform to discuss this difficult topic. Well, so far, At least in social networks, we do not have such platform, and it's a big question. So I understand that a big problem lies also in the fact that the society does not react as hard as you expect them when you raise these topics. I would like to give floor to Carlos to participate in this dialogue, in this conversation, and share your experience when such topics were raised in your country, uh, and when there was interventions to the work of the media in your motherland. So how did it happen? How did media manage to overcome this, opposition from maybe political elite and from the society?
Points out that in media terms, having an ideology, I mean, a set of ideas and beliefs, is not the same of actively being advocating for a party, right? In that sense, I think that when we have struggled with big polarization issues regarding the issues that we cover, corruption in El Salvador, war crimes, impunity, the lack of transparency from public officials, even they are from the right-wing party, the left-wing party, or even a party that claims not to have an ideology. I think it's very important for us to be transparent as media and establish dialogue. I think that the work of us, we have learned that the work of us as a media outlet doesn't end when we publish a big story or a big exclusive. It ends when we open different dialogue spaces, even online or offline, in order to explain people where we're coming from, explain how we did the investigation, answer the question, answer the criticism, establishing like a respectful dialogue, understanding that it's natural to be disagreeing with someone, it's desirable as well, and to vindicate the nuances to understand different complex phenomena. In our case in El Salvador, we have concluded that there's no such thing as objectivity. We believe more in transparency and being honest with our audience in terms of where are we coming from, how we have shaped the way we see the world. And in those cases, we think it works to open honest dialogue with people, basically.
So, Anna, tell us, please, how do you think these different functions are represented in the Ukrainian media, like the descriptive function, intervention, and do we have the harmonized balance between these functions? Yes, we do. Ukrainian journalism is rather strong journalism. As for the far right movements, it's not the problem of only Ukraine, but of the whole world. It's just that they said that the Ukrainian social experts say that Ukraine has its specifics where the state can't bring order, then the far right moods enter. And the problem is that the state can't control this aggression and to somehow direct it into the peaceful form. That's all. So, of course, the obligation of the journalist to talk or to bring up these difficult topics, because who else if not us? And protecting the population against displaying aggression and to solve all the issues in peaceful way. That's the aim of journalism also, because we're like a social institute. We are the communicator between different institutes, and we communicate information to the population, because the function of the journalist is not to say how to think right, but to say, to tell people what they are to pay attention to and to make them speculate on this or that. I understand that not everyone among us would like to see the problems that we have created, actually some aggressive, flows, but solution of these problems can depends upon our honest look at it. If we talk about everything and will not be silent this is our social function. If we say that each journalist, if journalist asked what is the social function of journalism, is to speak about problems and to speak about what must be solved. So we do not criticize, we just show the way.
The questions which need to be solved. That's it. It seems to me that a key problem which we face every day as media, as journalists, this is the lack of clicks, of advertising. It's difficult to survive as a media financially in general. And it seems to me that a lot of media inclined to write about very important topics and sensationalist topics. That is why I understand such problems that Zaborona faced, because they need to write about less popular topics. And now we can proceed to discuss a second topic.
Regarding the concept of partisanship of media, political allegiance, ideological allegiance, because obviously even if a media generally as an entity isn't adherent to certain political group, journalists are still people, and each journalist individually is subject to his or her own views and ideological opinions, which could end up with a strong sense of self-censorship when a person just decides to omit a certain topic because he or she may feel that it is not either patriotic or not politically correct to highlight this topic right now. There could be a big variety of reasons for why a person could decide to self-censor. So my question is, can a media be patriotic? Can a media be politically aligned? Can a media be partisan? We are all looking strongly, we are all looking into the example of the United States, where we see this strong partisan division between media. It's all over the professional community. Everyone is discussing how we have Fox News here, we have Washington Post, we have Vox, all different and all taking a very strong political stance, especially in light of the upcoming election. But how do you think the situation is right now in Ukraine, in light of the conflict, in light of the current political climate? Where should we go next?
Ну, если каждый из нас задаст себе этот вопрос,
If everyone asks this question, whether we shall be partisans, no, everyone will respond no. But the reality is that editorial offices are dependent on advertising and on the influence of their owners, which are most probably somehow related to politics. And it all has negative impact on independence of the editorial office. We shall be unbiased, of course, but if you take a look at the regional press, regional media, the dependence on the owners is only part of the problems. The second problem is that we might ourselves be dependent. If we're talking about Eastern Ukraine, sometimes journalists are partisans for one political movement or political party. So this is the situations that we can see in central Ukraine or western Ukraine. We feel this pressure and we exert this pressure on ourselves. That is why it's quite difficult to be above this and to be objective and biased when covering stories related to politics.
Subject from your external point of view, so to speak, after this time that you spent in Ukraine, interacting with the local journalist community, interacting with the people here, and seeing the reaction that your coverage of the far-right operations here are getting, how do you feel on this topic, especially if we're talking about Ukraine, and maybe in comparison to the situation in your home country?
Well, for me, I think that sometimes we have to define or really narrow down what we're talking about when we talk about media that's partisan. Now, I think you gave the best or worst example of that, like Fox News in the United States. I think it's inevitable that as journalists and as media outlets are going to have their biases. We all have our biases. We all, as objective as we try to be, we all have our views. But what has always struck me in the Ukrainian context, especially in the context of the still ongoing war, is that there is much more of a self-described patriotic push behind a lot of coverage, and not so much politicized coverage in other cases, especially leading up to the elections last year, but also partisan coverage. There's a media environment here that is in some ways foreign to me, where some outlets, some journalists, some newspapers, whatever, are clearly supportive of one candidate or one party over another, to the point where they think that that said candidate, them not winning means the end of the country. So what struck me particularly last year when I was here covering both the presidential and parliamentary elections for a number of international outlets was how heated the rhetoric was in terms of partisanship, not just from journalists, but from social media as well. There was really this sense that from a certain set of a very online set in Ukraine, that unless Petro Poroshenko wins, the country is just going to be immediately taken over by Russia. That, you know, those sorts of arguments and things that I think we all heard last year. I think what has been striking for me in terms of the far right coverage that I do is when I write, because I've written some about the far right in Canada, my own country, but I tend to focus on the far right across Central and Eastern Europe. So in addition to Ukraine, I write about the far right. For example, in the last year or a few months, I've written about the far right in Serbia, in Croatia, in Bulgaria, in Slovakia, for example, places like that. And of course, all over those countries, including my own, have their own issues with far right, with violent far rights or far right groups that are potentially quite dangerous. What has always struck me, of course, in a negative way, covering that in Ukraine, is that because of that this sort of patriotic push behind coverage here, or that when journalists, including international, there's this sense from some in the media community here that, and the broader community as well, that when we as foreign journalists particularly write about this country, we have to write about it in the best possible way because, of course, there is a war going on. You, as foreign journalists, the argument might go something like, you as foreign journalists should not be making too much light of the issue of the far right because Kremlin propaganda will pick up on it. That's not, I mean, part of that pressure is understandable, of course, because there is a war. But I haven't experienced that kind of pressure in any other country that I've covered. It is only in Ukraine where I write things about the far right or investigate the far right, and a lot of the feedback is, don't talk about it. Why are you writing about this? Why aren't you writing about the far right in X, Y, Z countries? And then I turn and I say, well, I am writing about it in those countries too. So the sense that I've got here is that self-described patriotism is, that's really been an issue for me to kind of wrap my mind around.
Thank you. I would also like to invite Enrique to pitch in on this, to share his experience from his home country and how does bias or political motivations or partisanship of media did it stand in the way of political dialogue and conflict resolution if we're talking about his country?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. To start with, yes, in a slightly different way. I mean, right now, Nicaragua is in a position where we're dealing with a very brutal dictatorship, and what polarization has done is that it has made it impossible to really create a wide enough social and political movement beyond, let's say, an initial wave of massive protests in 2018, beyond that, polarization has made it very difficult for all the sectors of society that are opposed to Daniel Ortega's regime to come together around a political and social agenda that can lead somehow to a democratic transition. And that has perpetuated a kind of deadlock. So yeah, we are dealing with something similar, although the context is slightly different. But I would like to take a step back and to look at some more of the structural issues that are behind this. From our perspective, quality, healthy, high-impact journalism ecosystem requires empowered audiences, just in the same way that a high-energy democracy requires empowered citizens. Much in the same way that, let's say, the transition to the knowledge economy has not been what is expected, because people, talent has not been formed, let's say, educational systems, etc., are not structured toward things like critical thinking, towards dissent, towards dialogue. So I think that it's important for us to consider some of these underlying structural issues, because otherwise the potential of journalism to really be this catalyst for more citizen participation, for higher quality public debate, will go unfulfilled unless we understand sort of the entire systems dynamics around these issues. So I think that from our perspective at Confidencial, we are increasingly concerned, as Carlos mentioned before, with what happens after we perform the journalistic work. So we do the investigation, we find the stories, we tell the stories, with ethical standards, with professional journalistic standards. But the real question is, what can we do? What should we be doing in order for that information or the analysis that we provide to really become a catalyst for people to make up their own minds, for people to participate in dialogue in good faith? And that doesn't mean, to not have strong positions or to shy away from debate, but to really know the difference between polarization and sort of empty conflict that is often the result of manipulation of political bases by political elites or by propaganda mechanisms, and sometimes by media outlets that may have the best intentions, but that are not sort of fully aware of this role that we can play. So in the case of Confidencial, for us, the real question is, how can we, beyond bringing information and analysis to our audience, how can we really create civic space for high quality dialogue, for dissent, and for the construction of some of these core competencies that as a society we need, and that are clearly not a priority in educational systems, they're not a priority in political systems, and certainly not in the economy either. So how can we build this ability and instill in people the importance of critical thinking, of dissent, of dialogue, of debate, of making up your own mind, looking at several angles and making up your own mind, and then also learning to tolerate other people's perspectives, so long as these perspectives are not harmful to yourself or to others? I think that I don't have many answers to that question, but at Confidencial, we're increasingly encouraged by the fact that we all recognize, from the commercial area, from the strategic area, the newsroom, the editorial team, the social media team, we all increasingly understand that this is perhaps the most important question for us to answer. How are we going to really empower our audiences to make up their own mind and to be able to be sort of full-fledged citizens and full-fledged individuals that can participate in dialogue, in dissent, without falling into polarization and meaningless conflict?
Thank you so much. I would like to address a follow-up question to Carlos, because obviously it's a big problem for us. It's a huge ordeal. The things that Michael just described about people taking sides and feeling strong emotions about his work on the far right. There is also a strong sense for people who need to feel belonging to a certain side when it comes to conflicts such as the one that has been happening inside Ukraine. So my question is addressed for Carlos. How can a journalist, how can a media take part take a side or not take a side during such conflicts when the urge to do that is very strong, either for safety reasons or for own political views and opinions.
Okay, thank you. I want to talk about one example, one project that we are currently developing in El Faro, which is called the Conversation Lab. It will be launched next year, and it's a platform that will be introduced within our own news site, elfaro.net, where the readers will be able to establish high-quality conversations with specialists, thematic specialists in different areas, economics, politics, civil rights, etc. And the aim of this platform is to open a safe space to tackle polarization that happens in social media, because we have concluded that social media, at least in our country, the conversation there tends to be very polarized, because it tends to value opinions in terms of popularity, such as if you have a lot of retweets, a lot of likes, and things like that. So we aim to open a platform that will try to put in the same place people who have strong belief that may be opposite, but that are willing to talk to the other position with respect. For example, one polemic topic in El Salvador is abortion. In El Salvador is one of the most toughest laws that penalize abortion in every case. And there have been some movements in the last years that have advocated to unpenalize it in some cases, right? So what we aim is, for example, in this case, to put people that have strong beliefs against abortion and people that have strong beliefs advocating for women's rights, including, for example, when they get pregnant because they were raped, and put them to dialogue, to have a conversation where they can be honest and disagree with we call it like not a civilized disagreement. We think that with this kind of dialogue, there might be better conversation in social and more change in terms of political and social dialogue.
Thank you. We have a question right now from the audience. Катя, я, наверное, адресую этот вопрос к вам. Нам задали следующий вопрос. В этой
Is for you. In the studio, they mentioned about the narratives of Russian propaganda. Do you think that journalists are to speak about political narratives? Sorry for have kept you waiting. I should say, I don't know if I will be able to answer your question, but it seems to me, and in our team in Zaborona, at Zaborona, we have a kind of a rule, or when we are selecting or choosing our approaches to what we are talking about or what we are reporting about, there's a very simple thing. We do not take any position because we always on the side of most vulnerable people. So Zaborona as media was formed on the basis of our team and our audience are people vulnerable, are very vulnerable people in our polarized, politicized environment, especially in the in the conditions of war. And we are vulnerable in many ways. Each of us has their own vulnerability. Which makes a human being or a person weaker in front of big politics or in front of the state. And that's why many are trying to label us, to give us a political label, because we understand, or we talk about the left dialects, for example. So it's the independent journalism. It exists in order to speak about interests of the most vulnerable groups. And it seems to me that here there is no, you're not choosing one party. Or you can't choose if any party, if it's the opposition party or those who are in the representatives of the authorities. So we are applying the approach where we can protect the interests of all those whose rights can be violated at any moment. Thank you. I think that there's no doubt that journalists in their work understand very well that their material, their reports, especially if we speak about the journalistic investigations, can have an influence on the political agenda or on the international, domestic, or can be, in the same direction that, or in the direction of some propaganda, for example, Russian propaganda. Anna, what do you think? To which extent should it influence the work of the journalist? And are there ways for media to have the correct balance? It's hard to find the balance, but there's only one advice. You have to comply with some rules, and you do not play political games. Of course, to do this, you have to be well educated. You have to have excellent mentors, editors who are going to be mentoring you, and a good media community that is going to support and not criticize or point out at your mistakes instead of supporting you. I heard that colleagues mentioned that it's rather difficult to combine what you want to write about and what your audience is ready to perceive. Katerina said a very interesting thing, that in their outlet, they are writing about people, and when you write about someone's fate, someone's destiny, that politics takes a secondary position. And if we speak about some political topics, it's not about the work of the office of the president or institutional, but when we speak about some routine politics, like everyday politics, then it's important to bring up some human stories and what they lead to, and then the conclusions will be obvious as well. It will be hard to be far too more involved in the game, but I think the bigger problem is in the journalists who are trying to impose the readers their political preferences, or they think that their political preferences are the right ones, the correct ones, and that's why they are to be communicated, and someone else's point of view is incorrect. So we are to understand that we shouldn't point out to people what they are to think, but we are to show what they should speculate on, which situation needs their attention, who did what, or where to look for some support or answers. And then we can minimize the influence of politics, because we can't hide from it. All of us are human beings. We're all people, and we all have our likes and dislikes, and it's really difficult to be apart from the situation. But if we remember that we are not to give instructions but to show the direction, I think it will be a lot simpler, as it seems to me. Thank you. So we have moved to another block that I wanted to discuss about the influence, about the changes that brought the social networks on the possibility of the political dialogue between the audience of different media outlets in the wider context. I like this example very much. It impressed me so much when I studied what is TikTok as a platform, And I have faced, I mean, I saw the video since the algorithm, the geographical algorithm in TikTok work differently than in Instagram or on Facebook. I started receiving lots of videos from Donetsk and Luhansk, and I saw in comments underneath, some just entertaining videos where the teenagers sing or dance, and I saw a strong dialogue in the comments among the representatives of their age group from all over Ukraine. And it's an important impulse for me because we're all used to seeing in our news feed, how like anger around certain news or outrage culture, a very strong negative charge. And also we saw how the bubbles are created, and people, and when it seems like everybody thinks the same way as them. And I would be very curious to hear the panelists, to which extent or what are the possibilities for media to enhance a positive role they can have to strengthen the dialogue urge and to involve not only politically loyal audience or that shares their values, but also to go wider so that to promote this way a dialogue and communication and to interact. And I would like to give floor to Carlos to give your comments concerning this topic.
Sorry, I was mute. Thank you. I think that social media has made magnificent things in terms of making information more accessible for people, and we have to value that. Nonetheless, we have to also be aware that in the last years, a lot of problems have generated in terms of misinformation, fake news spreading, and things like that. I think that there's a responsibility in social media companies like Facebook or Twitter to add regulations that, for example, the one that recently was added in terms of adding a seal in some Twitter accounts that state that they are state property media, just to let people clear that this is not a independent outlet, but it's probably a propaganda or a state property news company, right? For our case, I think that we have to value the microphone that social media and amplification that gives us the opportunity to reach more people, but we have to be aware of these problems. I think the platform that I just mentioned is in my previous comment, I think it's just a way to tackle the things that social media may not be generating, but we have, there's no such thing as an aim to stop using social media because of these problems like misinformation. I think it's responsibility of us as journalists, as media staff professionals, to keep fighting and to keep generating spaces and dialogue, open dialogue with people in order to combat misinformation. I think misinformation and the spread of fake news will not end up automatically in itself if we don't do something.
Thank you. I would like to forward the microphone to you. Regarding the same question, you have a general feeling your work is getting a lot of negative traction on social media, a lot of negative vibes. So how do you think, is there a way for media to negate that, or is it just something that needs to be pushed aside and work still needs to be done? And is there potential for dialogue if we're talking about people with polar views over social media?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that my view on social media, particularly websites like Facebook, Twitter, and Telegram, which I know is quite commonly used here, is that I'm not particularly confident at this point that social media has the ability to bridge some of these divides that we've been seeing for several years. I mean, obviously, we've been seeing them in the United States for since before the 2016 election of Donald Trump. We see them now in 2020. People, whether they're voters, whether they're journalists like myself, we all kind of on social media, we all inhabit our own little bubbles. It's not easy for example, it's not easy for me or the things that I do, the things that I write about. I don't. There are always sections of social media that I will always expect them to react negatively or not react at all to something that I write. I don't. I don't write what I do to please people or please particular people. But I think when over the say mostly the past 2 years, when I've been writing most intensely about the Ukrainian far right, of course, even with some of that negative feedback that I get, to put it politely, is what I have done is taken, believe it or not, taken some of it into consideration and think, are there things that I'm sometimes missing with my coverage? Am I not giving enough credence to another side or another view on the debate? And so that has informed, whether people want to believe this or not, it has informed the way that I've written a lot of things more recently. Now, again, like I said, I don't write to please critics. I think that's for any journalist writing to be liked. You're probably in the wrong profession then. But for me, I think it's not incumbent so much on journalists to be the ones facilitating the dialogue. I think sometimes that's beyond our scope and what we can do. But I think it's incumbent on us for some of these difficult discussions, it's incumbent upon us to try to almost provoke these discussions into happening. So, like many people here don't like talking about the far right, but when all of a sudden there's several large articles about it, or there's coverage in international media, then people have to talk about it. Mm-hmm. That's partly been the motivation with some of the things that I've written about the far right, and distress, not just in this country, because I feel in a lot of countries it's an under-addressed issue. I feel the way to do that sometimes is to start writing about it, to provoke, to ask some of the questions that I know some people don't want. Not only are they not interested in the answers, they're not interested in the question being asked. Now, is social media, the use of social media, the place to try and have some of these dialogues? Well, no, and I think that's part of the bind we all find ourselves in across a lot of different countries, is we know that there are dialogues and discussions that need to be had, that need to be facilitated across different partisan or other divides. We just don't entirely know how to do it. And I'd like to sit here and pretend that I've got some cure-all answer for us, but unfortunately I don't. So my role, what I'll continue to do, and I think what other journalists do as well, is to keep asking questions that are sometimes difficult, that people sometimes don't like hearing, and keep provoking, but at the same time taking some of that feedback into consideration, even if sometimes it's feedback that one might not be particularly interested in hearing. It's something to take into consideration as I keep obviously digging into these types of questions.
Okay, thank you. Анна, я передам микрофон к вам.
And now I give the word to Anna. I would like to hear your opinion on this window of opportunities for Ukrainian journalists and for Ukrainian society in general to enter into dialogue on the topic of non-governmental controlled territories. Well, we had an interesting experience at the onset of the epidemic. We used social networks not as a method of dialogue with our readers, but as a method of research. Together with the Institute of Sociology of Ukraine, we researched on the level of distress during the pandemic. The Institute prepared their sample, set the parameters of this research, and our task was to conduct this research. this research was also held on the occupied territories of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. So our answer to the question which level of distress Ukrainians have is also related to those people who live on the other side of the checkpoints. For us, this information was very valuable because when we think that we need to resolve a conflict, we forget about those people. We forget that we need to ask them. Usually people say that it's very difficult to ask those people that whom we cannot reach physically or by phone, but when you target advertising on Facebook to those regions, it is very easy to communicate with people who live there. And for example, as a method of sociological research, through Facebook, it was easy to do. We collected the necessary number of questionnaires for this research, for this sample, and we actually have conducted this research successfully. And then later, the Institute of Sociology presented this research. So if you want to do something, you will manage to find the points of communication with the audience. There were a lot of negative comments, a lot of negative feedback to our research. Though our research was not about the war, it was about the pandemic, the coronavirus, but we used a cover illustration which reminded people of LGBT flag, and that is why there were a lot of hate comments because of that. But it didn't prevent us from conducting this research. It actually happened, and we managed to get those answers from people living in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Unfortunately, we failed to cover the Crimea because from 2014, Facebook blocks advertising which is targeted at Crimea. But we understood that we can target advertising on Kherson region, and then we can increase the radius of this advertising to hear the opinions of people who live in the Crimea.
Of media not just doing reporting, exactly, that's like more of an in-depth research intervention, and it's a very interesting case in terms of how you actually use social media for that. Enrique, I would like to ask you about your experience, like the experience of your media in Nicaragua during the dramatic events of the last few years that took place, the protests and how they unraveled, and have social media dramatically changed the opportunity for dialogue, for conflict resolution, and what's your media's take on this?
Well, I think that in a similar vein to Carlos, I mean, the primary or the first thing that we would have to think and talk about when considering the impact of social media on our work is the fact that due to state censorship, which has, for example, taken us off the air on television, platforms such as YouTube have become the only way for us to distribute our content. So we know very well, let's say, the positive side of this coin. As for the negative side of this component, I think that we are definitely seeing a high degree of polarization in Nicaragua through social media. And I think that's something that's really important, at least from our perspective, is to think of these technology platforms not as the most important part of the discussion. In the end, they're just tools. They're important tools. They're tools that make a big difference. But a lot of the underlying issues, such as disinformation, such as polarization, have long predated the existence of these platforms. I mean, these platforms have changed the scope, the pace, the degree to which propaganda can spread or to which polarization or hate speech can spread. But these were all phenomena that existed before. And I think that, yes, it's important to address the ways in which these technology platforms have changed the pace and the scope and the degree of things. But if we focus exclusively on that and we don't go to the roots, we don't ask ourselves, well, why did this exist even before social media? Why are people so prone to anger or so prone to not criticizing or questioning something that they ideologically believe in. I think that those are some of the deeper questions that go beyond the technology that need to be asked. Having said that, there are a host of issues that need to be addressed regarding these technology companies. I think it's important for the media and quality journalism as a sector to have common mechanisms to address these technology platforms together. Things like what they've done to advertising revenue streams, for example, which squeeze our work, or how the algorithm or the different algorithms promote certain kind of sensationalist content over other kinds of content. These are all issues that need to be addressed, but I think that they would be best addressed together. I think that if independent media and journalists from different regions around the world get together to think about sort of what are some of the asks, what are some of the demands, and what are some of the strategies to put pressure on the technology companies, I think that's paramount. But ultimately, the truth is users themselves also need to be empowered about these things. I mean, in the end, if you think about it, if you think about the loss of privacy, if you think about how the data that we create as users on these platforms is ultimately what these platforms are monetizing, and you think about where that puts us as users of these platforms in such a big disadvantage, and how little has been done against that, I think that ultimately, in the same way that media outlets need to organize around these issues, probably users need to organize around these issues, different governments need to organize around these issues. Ultimately, the technology platforms cannot continue to kind of break things and ask questions later, which was one of the big mantras coming out of Silicon Valley early on, right? Is break things, who cares about the consequences? I think that that's always going to be the case. Technology will probably always be at the cutting edge. There will always be unregulated spaces. There will always be a next technological frontier that goes beyond existing regulatory frameworks. But I think that we need to be organized, and we need to be prepared for that. And again, it's not the first time that these kinds of things happen. If you analyze it historically, although again, differences in scope, in degree, in pace, but the printing press or the radio or television, how did those different technologies also, how are they far ahead of regulation? How did they change politics? How did they change social dynamics? And how can we learn for the lag in adaptation from journalism, from users, to be shorter and shorter each time? I think that those are kind of the things that we have in mind in Confidencial. So on the one hand, we understand that we would not be distributing our content today if it weren't for platforms like YouTube, given government censorship. But we're equally concerned by the fact that, for example, in a country that doesn't have such high internet penetration like Nicaragua, we're equally concerned of how do we get to people who don't have access to the internet. And maybe for us, that's why, although the sort of combating the downside of social media and technology is really important, and it is high on our agenda, it's also not the end-all be-all of our discussion or what keeps us up at night. I think that the fact that we come maybe from a market where the technology has penetrated slightly less than in other parts of the world, I think that helps us keep focused also on some of the more underlying structural issues behind it.
Okay, thank you. We also got a question from the audience. It is about turning back to the far right. So there is a question, how do the participants feel about the problematic of the far right in Ukraine? Do you feel that it is being downplayed, that it is not being talked about for whatever reasons, and there is a certain spiral of silence in place? Michael, maybe we start with you.
Right. I think that there continues to be very much a tendency for many people in Ukraine, but also many supporters of Ukraine abroad, to very much downplay the issue of the far right in this country. I think it stems from, because I believe several years ago, maybe 2016, 2017, I think I was actually in some ways one of these people, one of these journalists who didn't look into the far right as much here, who I think in my own way, I also didn't think it was that.
Я не вважав, що це була така вже ж велика проблема, і, можливо, також її не приділяв достатньої уваги. Але однією з проблем також було, що дуже багато людей в Україні та за кордоном діють так або мислять так, що ситуація з ультраправими в Україні така ж, як була, наприклад, у 2015-2016 роках. Тоді це була проблема, але вона не мала такого масштабу, як зараз. І, наприклад, навіть 2 роки тому необхідно більше було уваги звернути. Я, наприклад, дуже жалкую, що я прискіпливіше не поглянув на цю проблему, тому що завжди є така, знаєте, тенденція применшати значимість якоїсь проблеми. Не було ні дослідження, наприклад, в цій країні. І в 2018-2019 роках, я думаю, багато людей з міжнародної спільноти, вони почали розпізнавати цю проблему ультраправих в цій країні.
We're in 2020, we're nearing the end of 2020, and I'm still constantly hearing claims that I think are completely wrong and baseless, that the issue with the far right here is identical or largely the same as it is in a place like Germany or another European country. And sadly, it's not. And I think there has to be a recognition that two things can be true at the same time. One, yes, there is Kremlin pro-Russian propaganda that paints the far right as some evil at every turn that's going to pop out and take over the country, which is absurd. But what can also be true at the same time is that there is a real issue with the far right. I think there needs to be more acknowledgement that an issue like the far right, it can both be a target, it can both be something played up and propagandized by one side, but at the same time, it can also be a actual proper true issue on the other. So in short, there is still very much this tendency to downplay and sometimes even deny that there's a far-right problem in this country, and it's something that, with my reporting and research and writing about it, it's something that I've tried to combat by getting information and research and articles out there. So.
Okay, thank you. We got feedback from our audience on the subject. Very thoughtful comments saying that conflicts and differences are inevitable, however, violence is not. Unfortunately, a lot of our media are republishing violent calls to action from the far right and consider that as a patriotic action. At the same time, this kind of behavior motivates violence. It is understandable that you can simply ignore such calls to action from the far right, but we have social media where basically everything is possible.
Yeah, I think I feel that's the case as well in Ukraine, where there are sometimes quite openly violent and other communications from the far right that are given more mainstream attention than they should. I think one of the paramount issues concerning the far right in this country is that there is a tendency to let them too close into the mainstream or treat them as more mainstream actors than they should be. And that goes from republishing or taking seriously their statements about violence, excusing their violent actions, and not holding them accountable for their violent actions, which of course there certainly have been over the past few years and recently. That impunity and lack of accountability that was identified in research several years ago, and that is still the case here in Ukraine. And I wish I had some sort of magic cure for it, but I think again, like with part of what the work that I do, I feel that getting information and analysis out there and talking about it, and essentially what I've seen a lot of my work, what motivates a lot of my work, I think, is forcing people to have that conversation whether they like it or not. And that's something I'm going to keep doing, and I think that there are more and more people, both within Ukraine and abroad, but also in other countries concerning their own issues with the far right, to start having some of those complicated discussions that also also don't just deal with the far right, but deal with issues about historical memory, issues about communism, Nazism, Holocaust. There's every country has its demons that it has to deal with, and that includes my own as well. All of us in our respective countries, far right related or not, we need to always ask ourselves difficult questions, even when the response to us asking those difficult questions is to tell us to stop asking them.
Thank you. Анна, у меня еще один вопрос от аудитории. К нам поступил, он напрямую не связан.
I have one more question from the audience, Anna, and it's not directly connected with our topic about the conflict resolution and your opinion about it. So, what is the development of the printed media do you see in the modern society? But minding that we are to attract all the society if we are wishing for the dialogue, that this is a very legitimate question within this context. Development of the printed media. Well, if someone thinks that printed media will disappear one day, then I'm not one of them. I mean, you know, it's people used to say that theater will disappear, that cinema will disappear. Now it's very popular to say that cinemas will disappear because there are streaming platforms. But when you communicate or speak with people who work in the movie industry, in the film industry, they will tell you this will never happen, no matter how many streaming platforms there are. The same refers to the printed media outlets. But the question is, the Ukrainian problem is, we are losing the subscribers for these printed media outlets, and we do not have the points of sales. If we take a look at the situation in Kyiv, there are no point of sales to sell this newspaper or magazine because they are getting less and less. The number of points of sales reduced. But if we want some delivery via Ukrposhta, Ukrpost, or via some, some mediators, it can either get lost or just wouldn't be delivered at all. So we have a problem with the delivery to the audience. But if we speak about the context, then it doesn't matter if it's a printed media or online media outlet. The information is the same, and we have the same tasks. And there are even such common editorial offices when one editorial office does both printed media outlet and works for online media outlet. So as a journalist, I do not see any problems here, if it's on paper or if it's on the internet. But the problem is the printed media, they do not have the sphere of dissemination. So that's why they lose the readers, and so they lose funds and they shut down.
From being over, so I would like to ask all our participants to take part in this final round. I'm going to address our guests from abroad, and I'm going to address people here in the studio and Katya. So if you can, like in a few words, please say what some thesis or two about what you think a media should do to strengthen their role as a platform for conflict and problem resolution. And I would like to ask Enrique to start, of course, based on his experience and his own background from Nicaragua.
Yes, so I think that there are a couple of things. The first thing that comes to mind, really, within Confidencial, we've been working to really conceive ourselves so that everybody within the organization, reporters, the commercial team, management, we all are learning to see ourselves as social or institutional or structural entrepreneurs even. We conceive our journalistic role as the co-creation of a vision of society. And that's a co-creation that takes place between our newsroom, between everybody within our team, but also with our audiences. So I think that this change in perception that we're having about ourselves and about our potential as social, structural, institutional entrepreneurs within society is paramount. And then externally, that translates into, for us, it has translated into learning how to give ourselves margin for error, how to create spaces within which we can experiment, where we can innovate, we can fail and fail fast and then try again and hopefully fail better next time, but fail at giving that extra mile of not just creating quality content, but really going far enough to empower citizens so that they can have more critical mind, so that they can make up their own mind, and so that they can become really the most important power holders in society. We think that that has been our approach at Confidencial, and we don't have all the answers. We wouldn't say we've succeeded yet, but we certainly have found a way to constantly experiment, and we have found a way to give ourselves that margin for error, but we have a very clear vision of where we're going. So that for us, that's the key.
Okay, thank you. Michael, can you please give a brief comment as to which obstacles do you think the media community in Ukraine needs to overcome to strengthen its role as a platform for conflict resolution and problem resolution?
I think especially related to issues like the far right and nationalism, I think the most important thing for Ukrainian media, Ukrainian journalists to start doing more of is to start talking about and start asking some of those questions that many of them, for some understandable reasons sometimes, have been quite hesitant to ask. I think it would really be beneficial for Ukrainian media to not be as concerned or worried about asking the quote unquote the right questions, or asking the patriotic questions, or asking questions that will get a certain sector of society, or including the far right, that might get them angry at them. Again, it's to some extent it's easy for me to say something like that. I'm not from this country. I can write about things in this country, and I can write about potentially dangerous things in this country, but then I can get up and leave. So if there's, for Ukrainian media to be able to do that, to maybe start asking some of those more difficult questions, start exploring some of those difficult questions, and not being worried about the backlash that comes, it's something Ukrainian media can't do it alone. It needs solidarity from colleagues across Europe, even those of us across Canada. We can be solid. We can offer some solidarity sometimes as well. But in all seriousness, none of us are in this alone in every country that we're in, trying to cover some of these difficult issues. We're always going to get backlash of different kinds, and journalists, media from all the different countries that are here, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Canada, and Ukraine, for example, we need to have solidarity and develop that and share and learn from each other, and I think that only through that, working together across borders, can we really start to ask those questions that we know deep down that we need to start asking more of.
Okay. Carlos, how about you? I would love to hear a brief comment from you before we finish.
Yes, thank you. It's a very brief comment. I think we, as media outlets, have to assume and understand that we serve diverse communities. We do not just serve the people who think editorially and share the same belief that editorially we as a media outlet have. For example, in El Salvador, we have been, last 3 months, we have been attacked by the government in terms of social media causing a malicious audit by the Ministry of Finances and things like that. But we have to assume that when we keep doing investigations that reveal that as well is possibly doing some things or wrongdoing, we have to understand that we are giving this information to people that support the president as well. And in those cases, we have to be aware and open to hear them, their backgrounds, and understand why they support or why they think that our content is not good. And then is when we think we will be doing a better job in terms of connecting more people and combating polarization.
Thank you. So we are at the last minute of our conversation. I would like to thank everyone who participated here in the studio or over Zoom. We had a wonderful discussion, and basically I think Michael summed it up pretty well, that our biggest point is about talking, bringing up uneasy topics, making the stronger the voices, the more chances is of them being heard, and less people being underrepresented in the media, in the agenda. and the more productive is the result for the society. Thank you, everyone.